Good morning. My name is Joseph Busch. I'm sorry that I can't be with you at the best practices session today, but I've made a recording of the presentation that I intended to give. This presentation focuses on the use of business classification, semantics, and metadata to support risk and compliance use cases at the African Development Bank, a multilateral development organization, or MDO, with the overall goal of sustainable economic development and social progress in African countries that contributes to poverty reduction. But the following use cases are also common for public and commercial organizations with public accountability. The first use case relates to access rights. It's about complying with access policies by classifying documents so that appropriate access rights are provided and enforced. The second use case is related to disclosure and complying with public disclosure policy so that approved versions of specified documents are made public and others are not. And the third use case is related to records management compliance for retention and disposition of documents. A business classification schema is based on business functions like finance, human resources, and information technology, as well as business process activities. Business process activities may be well-defined standard operating procedures like procurement, HR, and in the case of multilateral development organizations, where a key activity is the operation of development projects. Other business processes may be less well documented and need to be elicited from process owners. A business classification schema is hierarchical with implicit inheritance of metadata properties specified at each hierarchical level. This diagram shows an example of a business classification schema. Note that the business classification schema may be linked to an enterprise resource planning or ERP system of record when it exists to support a business process activity. Metadata should be defined to support the use cases. It should be automatically generated by business rules and other methods as much as possible, and only minimally entered manually. Metadata values should be managed vocabularies from authoritative sources, such as reference data from enterprise resource planning systems of record as much as possible. Where metadata are not from managed vocabularies, such as title and file name, they should be based on naming conventions or automatically generated from metadata components. At the bottom of the slide is an example of such a title and file naming convention. This diagram shows an example of a business classification schema taxonomy. In this example, the buildings, facilities, and logistics function has a business process activity, buildings, and facilities, and a subactivity, lease and sublease management. There is an activity instance for a specific building under which documents related to the lease and subleases are filed. Document types are genres that should be scoped by templates, meaning that there can be a template defined for the document type. Some document types may be generic, such as correspondence or memorandum. More specific document types may be specified by standard operating procedures. Templates should include the appropriate metadata scheme and business rules to populate the metadata values. One of the main activities of multilateral development organizations is planning and supervision of development projects undertaken by one or more countries. Each project, and indeed every multilateral development organization activity, involves the creation and collaboration around different types of documents. For example, For the African Development Bank, there are standard operating procedures for sovereign development projects. This business process is divided into 6 distinct project phases: programming, identification, preparation, appraisal and approval, implementation, supervision, and completion or cancellation. One method to facilitate collaboration and document management is the development of templates that standardize the form, structure, and metadata of key document types, such as the reports that are generated in conjunction with each phase of the development project lifecycle, as shown in this slide. A template related to specific types of reports can be associated with a specific phase in the project lifecycle when that type of report is generated, and specific metadata and metadata values can automatically be filled in based on this context. Classifying development project documents using the Business Classification Schema will guide the user to the activity instance. The development project activity instance identifier should be used or could be used to query the enterprise resource planning system of record and retrieve related metadata associated with the project, such as project name, project manager, region, country, sector, subsector, and so on, as shown earlier in slide 3. The same principle could be used for other business process activities, such as finance, procurement, and human resources, that have an enterprise resource planning system of record. In these cases, there could be different standard identifiers used to query and retrieve related metadata associated with the activity instance. Classifying documents with the Business Classification Schema enables compliance with records management policy for retention and disposition of records. Each business process activity in the Business Classification Schema constitutes a record series. A record series is a group of related records that can be disposed of together. The record schedule is a listing of all the record series with instructions on how long to keep them, when their retention period begins and ends, and their typical disposition. Disposition is the process of reviewing a group of records whose retention period has ended to determine whether they should be retained as records, archived to preserve their historical value to the organization, or destroyed. Each business process activity in the Business Classification Schema has a metadata property that identifies the business value of the documents classified in that activity or record series. Each business value has a retention period associated with it. An example from the African Development Bank is shown in the table. The business value and retention period are the metadata properties used to automate the disposition of record series in the records management application. This diagram illustrates how the business process activity metadata in the Business Classification Schema prepares the record series in the document management application to be disposed according to the instructions in the record schedule in the records management application. Similarly, classifying documents with the Business Classification Schema enables compliance with disclosure and access to information policy. In the Business Classification Schema, the security classification is initially set at the function level. While the security classification is inherited hierarchically, it can be overridden at any level and further inherited. For example, at the African Development Bank, all institutional legal and agreements documents are classified as restricted at the function level, but a final signed agreement can be reclassified as public when that is appropriate. The disclosure and access to information level further distinguishes the restricted classification into confidential and strictly confidential. The default level of the Business Classification Schema is usually confidential. At the African Development Bank, the level for personal identifying information, PII, investigations, and board committee documents is strictly confidential. The disclosure and access to information class and level are the metadata parameters that identify the appropriate disclosure series in which a document belongs. An example from the African Development Bank is shown in the table. A disclosure series is a group of related records that can be disclosed or restricted together. The disclosure schedule is a listing of all the disclosure series with instructions on what document status changes and other events provide the triggers for automating the appropriate disclosure of and access to the items in the records management system. The diagram on this slide illustrates how the business process activity metadata in the Business Classification Schema prepares the disclosure series in the document management application to be disposed according to the instructions in the disclosure schedule in the records management application. To summarize, this paper discussed best practices for business classification risk compliance. I discussed how a business classification schema taxonomy inherits metadata and populates metadata properties hierarchically. I described how the business classification schema taxonomy includes the retention label and the security classification that ultimately applies to documents in the document management system. I explained how this automates the record disposition and disclosure of certain records as mandated by organizational policies. When reference data from enterprise planning applications, such as SAP, managed vocabularies, and naming conventions are used, metadata values will be consistent and population of metadata can be largely automated. Integrating a business classification schema with document management facilitates compliance with records management and disclosure and access to information policies. It also increases the association of usable metadata with documents, which reduces errors by providing more reliable search results and overall optimizes staff productivity. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please send them to my email, and there's more information at this URL that links you to related presentations, documents, and recordings. Thank you very much.